So, Mental Health Week on social media, possibly the worst thing for our mental health if research is anything to go by. I had a few conversations with people specifically this week in this context, and a few of my female friends were asking questions because it seemed like there was a real lack of understanding of how and why men don't open up in terms of talking about feelings and their emotional and mental health. So I did a quick infographic. So I'm giving you this as a relative thing for me, and then I'm going to give you this basic concept. Over the time that you know someone and have exposure to them as a man, you will begin to open up more. This line here presents that growth. So meet somebody, assumedly down here, whether that's a friendship that latterly becomes a relationship or in whatever context, but arguably at the beginning of a relationship, you tend to not be particularly open. Over time, you get to know the person, you become more familiar, and arguably you get to the stage up here, which is your point of comfort. The point of comfort could be anywhere on this upward trajectory, but say here is the actual moment where you decide to have the conversation about how you feel. It goes straight back down to zero, to this baseline in a conversation. If I say that I'm not feeling something here, or I'm upset or whatever, generally you will plummet from the point where you want to open up, which is up here, back to the starting point again, very quickly. So I drew this little infographic of mine, and it covers over the last 4 years since I was in my last relationship. And the assumption was that leaving that relationship down here in the bottom, I wasn't prepared to be open and to talk about that. So the trajectory is arguably the same for most men. Either we want to talk about it or we don't. There's no kind of midpoint here where you kind of go up and then it goes along and then down. It basically does this trajectory straight up to the point where you want to talk and then straight down. What I identified in myself was the reason for not wanting to continue being open with that person in that relationship. So having been arguably single for 4 years, I have met lots of women through that time, but they have never managed to fulfill my emotional and psychological needs, which is why we never became, girlfriend, boyfriend, whatever you want to call it. So I identified 3 specific points that I wanted to just kind of show, mostly to women, but also to men, so that they maybe can understand their own mental health journey. I'm not obviously a psychologist, but I have made a pretty successful living for more than 24 years in kitchens, and generally in life, learning and watching other people and seeing behavior patterns. After I split up with my ex down here, I went through a period where I didn't really want to open up, didn't want to speak to anybody. About there, I probably met somebody and became comfortable enough to possibly have the conversation. And it brought me to this point here. Specifically, I identified that there was a suppression of trauma, which was the breakup of the relationship. Well, arguably was up here. But after the relationship ended, to get back to this point where I was prepared to open up and talk about things again, it fell out of the sky because I was too busy suppressing the trauma that I went through in the relationship ending over here. So this girl disappeared for whatever reason. Probably my fault. But we certainly didn't end on terrible terms, but such is life. So back to square one again. Moving through another year, that's what these marks are at the bottom roughly. I got back to this point up here where I met someone, we dated exclusively, and in the interim period of that becoming exclusive, and no, it wasn't quite Facebook official, but it was certainly there or thereabouts, but I had experienced in this part of my journey things within her character which left me questioning whether or not she could fulfill my emotional and my psychological needs, my mental health. And she couldn't, because she was dealing with her own traumas, which is great and fine. But it got to this point and I experienced a regressed trauma from something which had happened in my life at that point, probably 8 years prior. And all these memories came flooding back, reinforced that what I thought was maybe not quite right about her here, and I fell out of the sky again, back down here. Just probably maybe over a year ago, possibly longer ago now, I started that journey again. I met somebody else, and I've labelled up here a PTSD. So I didn't have a particularly happy childhood, despite what may have been on the surface. I was processing all sorts of things, good, bad, and different. And what I learned when I was a child was the basic fight or flight instinct, which is ingrained within us, is the thing which keeps us alive. If someone's attacking you, you want to run away, fight another day. You only really fight if you absolutely have to. It should arguably be your last resort, turn the other cheek and all of that kind of stuff. But PTSD for me, even in adulthood now, is still a thing. It's just that I've got better at managing it, coping with it, understanding it, being able to process it. So I, for a whole host of reasons I won't bore you with, but I don't like people touching my neck. I don't like somebody physically being close to my head or my neck. Sorry, I don't need that anymore. So I have this thing where I don't like people touching my head or my neck, and it can trigger that fight or flight thing. So if I'm standing, maybe listening to music, or I have headphones in, and someone comes along behind me and grabs me by the head or the neck, it sends me into like a full-scale sort of mental trauma breakdown, regressing 30 years. And that's a bit weird to try and explain to somebody, right? And if you are in that position where you suffer from these sorts of things, you have to try and be able to convey that in a relationship sense. But it's not the kind of thing that you would mention on a first date, probably not even a 10th date. It would take you a really long period of time before you could become comfortable enough to have that conversation to explain why you don't like your head or your neck being touched. So that's happened to me a few times in life, and I've tried addressing it with partners and previous girlfriends, and for a combination of reasons, we aren't together anymore, and I wish them all well. But for me, I'm very seldom confused as somebody who doesn't communicate particularly well. People tend to understand what I say. You might not like what I say, and that's fine. That's totally cool. I have no requirement to be right. It's coincidental with the nature of my job. When people come to me for advice, from having been in business, from having traveled the world professionally now for more than a decade, amongst other things, people come to me for advice, then I'll give them the truth. And you don't necessarily need to like it. But if you just want someone to tell you something, go and ask one of your other friends. That's not the kind of person that I am. It's not the kind of friend that I am. So the three kind of take homes that I can offer you is that on this little scale, as the time continues and the guy is going to open up. Now, this time scale, although I've noted it in years on my diagram, could be even longer. It could be 10 years, it could be 20 years in between points where this trajectory gets to the point where they're capable of conveying their problems and their thoughts. Your job as a woman or as a friend is just to listen and to hear. Now, the two things are not necessarily the same, although they arguably mean the same thing by way of definition. Very often we listen to people. We listen to people talk and get angry and get upset and vent. But the difference between men and women generally is that if you come to a man and you bring this kind of energy at that point on your trajectory, he'll probably just listen, put his arm around you, comfort you, try to help you in whatever way they feel at that point. It's not your place to say to them that they should do this, they should do that, unless you're some sort of trained therapist. Sometimes just being there is enough. Being open, honest, approachable, allowing somebody to feel comfortable and confident to have that conversation with you, because that, for a man, is the most vulnerable and their most, possibly their weakest point that they will experience in their life. And if a man, especially a partner, is prepared to show this vulnerability and wrongly perceived weakness in front of you, that is a real privilege. I have only shared that moment in my life maybe 10 times, and I'm very open. You'll all know me. I'm quite happy to answer questions and tell you my story. I've no interest in hamming it up for Instagram likes. That's not my nature. But 10 women out of the however many hundreds of thousands, possibly millions I've met through my life, where I felt safe enough to have those kinds of conversations. And one was very good. Only one. And this isn't me bashing women or partners. I'm just kind of trying to convey to you that if I, as a very, very open and honest person, have done that 10 times and my success rate was less than 1 in 10, you have to understand the context for you and for your partner who maybe isn't as open. It could be that you're the first person that he's ever opened up to. And that could mean that with a 10% success rate, if I use my own metrics, that you may have to have that conversation with him 10 times before you get to the point where you get him, he gets you. Just being there and telling them that it's okay to get to this point here, that's important. Because if you don't feel confident in opening up and showing your weakness and your vulnerability, if you have a problem doing that, the first time that you do it, if she turns around and says, pull yourself together or whatever, it will set you back and you go back to the bottom of that scale and you've got to climb that ladder again. So I use this scale just to kind of give you some rough ideas of my own journey just for the last few years. And I just wanted to have this conversation in the hope that maybe it helps one woman to be open and receiving of that kind of energy from a partner. It's not an easy thing as a man in the modern world, especially out with the context of social media, to be open and honest and to have feelings and to cry and everything. I've never been a particularly big crier, but heaven mend you when it does happen. It's a bit of a snot fest. I think I process emotions quite well, but that PTSD that will never leave me. I don't believe, 30 years, that is a learned behavior that's been inbuilt into my brain, that if someone appears around my head or my neck, that gotta get out of there. And I had this moment with this girl. It wasn't actually around my head or my neck, but she nipped me, she hurt me. And it's quite a childish, petty thing to do, I suppose, in many ways. But as part of a relationship, could be deemed to be fun or whatever. But the pleasure pain axis is 70% identical. So the journey that you're on when you're enjoying something and the journey that you're on when you hate something are 70% identical. Although people don't normally believe me, about 70% of the journey of doing something that you really don't enjoy, once you reach that 71st%, you actually begin to enjoy it. Likewise, when you've been enjoying this upward trajectory curve to that 70% of something which has been enjoyable, you fall off the precipice and you come straight back down again. So we've probably all been tickled before. And there will be a time in your memory, from childhood probably, where you remember being tickled by a brother, sister, relative, uncle, whatever it is. And it goes from being really funny to being hysterically funny, to the extent where your central nervous system goes into a complete meltdown and you're physically incapable of actually trying to stop the person or whatever, because your central nervous system becomes overloaded with stimulus and informations. And that is your body fighting your fight or flight thing, right? You want to run away, but you can't, because they've pinned your arms down, or they're kneeling on you, or something like that. The point that you get to where it stops becoming hysterically funny, it goes straight down and you hate it. And at that point in your brain, you want it to finish there and then, or in your mind you think the world might end, I might die here because this is so bad. That is your fight or flight mechanism. And it is that, I believe, which governs this journey in terms of men opening up about their mental health. So something which at one point became helpful or enjoyable goes the other way, and then it can't come back again. You'll never want to be tickled again, beyond a very low level kind of tickling, prodding, stroking, whatever. But once you get to that point, as a man, if you turn round and say, please don't do that, just be wary that there could be a whole host of reasons why he doesn't like that, or why he's asked you not to do that. You don't necessarily even need to ask. Just stop doing it. Do your best not to do it again, because you never know how that behavior at that point and that choice could reset that time opening up continuum again. So yeah, thanks for coming to my TED Talk.